everyone. Welcome to the TR2 World Forum digital debate series titled Designing the Future of Planet Earth Towards the Green Transition, which includes a series of discussions on the trending issues of climate change and energy transition. My name is Samet Shahin. I'm a researcher at TR2 World Forum, and today we will have the sixth session of our debate series with the title of Cleaning the World's Energy Powerhouse, the Gulf States and Green Transition, with my distinguished guests. The global green transition is a key aspect of the strategy to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, particularly as it relates to 2050 net zero commitments. This transition poses perhaps a greater conundrum for the Gulf states than any other region. Not only do fossil fuels constitute the basis of regional economies, they are also some of the largest energy suppliers for an energy-hungry world. Acknowledging the global warming scenarios that could see the region's living conditions pushed to the extremes, some of the leading energy producers, such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain, have recently made decarbonization commitments. However, transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables is easier said than done, considering the transition process is laden with political, economic, and infrastructural costs. In this session, the future of Gulf states in terms of climate policies and the implications for the global energy outlook will be discussed. Let me introduce you my distinguished guests. Joining me today, Amina Bakar here. Amina is Deputy Bureau Chief and Chief OPEC Correspondent at Energy Intelligence. Welcome, Amina. I would like to introduce Dr. Carol Nachle. Carol is the founder and the Chief Executive Officer of Crystal Energy. And Karim Elgendi with us. Karim is Associate Fellow at Environment and Society Program of Chatham House. Again, welcome everyone. Amina, I want to open up the discussion with you. What have been the impact of the green transition on the Gulf hydrocarbon sector so far?
Thank you, Samet, and thank you very much for including me in this conversation. As we all know, the energy transition is not something that anyone can ignore. This is a trend that's been happening, and Gulf states realize that this is something that they have to adapt to and set strategy in order to achieve. And that's why that we recently heard from the Gulf states setting net zero emission targets. The UAE did this, followed by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, etc. So they realize that the transition is coming. They have a strategy and a plan in place. But at the same time, they do want their hydrocarbons to remain relevant for the longest time possible. So for them, this doesn't mean an immediate abandonment of hydrocarbons. They're still investing heavily in expanding their upstream. We have the UAE and Saudi Arabia both expanding their oil production capacity. The UAE wants to go to 5 million barrels a day by 2030. By 2027, Saudi Arabia aims to grow its production to 13 million barrels. That's an additional 1 million barrels. And in parallel to that, they have their renewable energy strategies, which are long-term goals. Saudi Arabia, for example, by 2030, it wants to have renewable energy projects supply 50% of its domestic energy. The UAE, on the other hand, has a target of 50% by 2050, and that's 44% from renewables and 6% from nuclear, and that's just clean energy. So these are the targets that they've set. They're still investing in the upstream sector, and these targets will also enable them to free up more oil for exports. So you're going to get like the economic benefits of additional exports, plus the diversification of their economy. Their new renewable sectors creates new jobs, and it helps aid revenues from the non-oil sector. So that's as well helping their economies long term.
Thank you, Amina. I want to ask the same question and move on. Carol, how has the green transition been received in the energy sector in the Gulf thus far?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me with you today. Look, when we talk about energy transition, especially if you're sitting here in Europe, for instance, people tend to think that that's it, it's a threat, it's an imminent threat to oil exporters, oil and gas exporters, hydrocarbon exporters. And this is primarily OPEC countries and Middle Eastern countries, the GCC in particular, because they build their wealth on these export revenues. However, the problem with this kind of perception is that it forgets that the energy transition does not happen overnight. It's a long-term process. It takes decades to materialize. Yes, there will be, if everything goes according to the plans that we are hearing and are being announced, there will be less and less demand for hydrocarbons. But we have to go back to basic economics, because if you say that the demand is shrinking, and honestly, nobody knows when that will happen. People talk about peak oil demand, but you just need to look at the various forecasts and the various scenarios, and you can see how within one agency there is a massive gap between one scenario and the other, and all these scenarios are built on assumptions, and God knows what goes into those assumptions, so it's very difficult to compare. But even if we believe, for example, we have more faith into these scenarios, we can see that there is a consensus that there will always be a demand for oil and gas for many years to come. And in this reality, so if you have still the demand there, but it is shrinking, it is declining, this means that the market is shrinking. In basic economics, this means that the low-cost producer is the last to leave the market. And who is the low-cost producer here? We're talking about the GCC countries, the Saudi Arabias of this world, the UAE, Kuwait, even Iraq is also among the lowest cost producer. So for them, it can actually be an opportunity to take advantage of these cheap assets that they have, and use it to be the last to leave the market, though I don't think the market is going to disappear suddenly. Now, that is conditional on the fact that they invest more in diversifying their economies, because when you say that you are the low-cost producer, you should be able to sustain lower prices, lower oil prices, because this becomes the reality of a shrinking market. But if you talk about the bigger picture, the macro picture, the dependence of these countries on oil and gas revenues means that they need higher prices than what they need to cover simply their cost of extraction and production. So, and this is why you see that in the region, they are moving ahead with diversification, economic diversification. It's not at a level where me as an economist would say that said they are out of the danger zone and they have a well-diversified economy, because yes, they might say that, oh, look at the non-oil GDP, it is growing and it's going very well. No, it remains dependent on oil price. So you can see the positive correlation between non-oil GDP and oil price. So they are still dependent on oil revenues, oil and gas revenues. So I guess if they accelerate the trend towards economic diversification, I think the energy transition might actually bring more opportunity than people realize for the countries in the Middle East.
Thank you, Carol. Karim, what are your thoughts on green transition in the Gulf?
Sure. I mean, my colleagues have already covered the apparent contradiction that one often sees between the role of the GCC exporters in the energy market, as well as their attempts to decarbonize internally in order to free up perhaps some of their energy for export, especially given the current prices. But there's also another climate angle, in my opinion, which is why I think the GCC countries, at least some of them, seem to have embraced the transition towards the new climate economy, if I may call it so, more than just attempting to manage that transition. There's an attempt to jump on the bandwagon and perhaps even steer that bandwagon, I I would even say. There's a framework that has been developed in Saudi Arabia that seems to have received a lot of acceptance within some GCC countries, called the circular carbon economy. It's been marketed globally beyond the GCC as an alternative approach for managing carbon, different from the current model that we have, which is energy efficiency, electrification, decarbonization through renewables, etc. And that in itself suggests that there is a new framework, a new framing for how the GCC wants to go about it wants to go about this transition, but also how it wants to manage its climate action. And then there's the other side, which is purely related to climate, which is collaboration. There is ongoing collaboration now between GCC countries, and that is evident not only within the climate negotiations that one sees at the conferences of parties, but also you see it within the Saudi-led Middle East Green Initiative, which isn't about energy at all. As a matter of fact, it's mostly about everything but energy. So there are additional aspects of the GCC transition, climate transition, if I may call it so, that suggests that the only driver isn't just addressing that imbalance that we had previously. One of my colleagues, Laden from Chatham House, has written that paper a few years ago, suggesting that the current trend in the Gulf and definitely in Saudi Arabia was going towards a net importer, and that had needed to be addressed, and that was mostly to do with lack of energy efficiency internally. So that's certainly one driver, but there's also another climate driver that I would like to add.
Okay, thank you, Karim. I want to continue with this policy-making aspect of the issue. Amina, besides constituting the base of economic growth, profits from fossil fuels are the mainstay of political stability in the 6 Gulf states. Considering that uncertainties over policies and demand outlooks would create a strong risk of future volatility in energy markets, how could the green transition potentially affect the political trajectory in the region?
It's a good question. I just wanted to add something to the previous issue that we've discussed concerning the transition. One of the main reasons that Gulf states are also taking part or have announced these very ambitious strategies is because they want to manage the pace of the transition. There's a lot of criticism that, especially in Western countries, that they just want to jump into a transition, but we're not ready yet. Renewable energy is not available like we know, and it can't sustain base load. So it has to be a gradual process, and this is something that Gulf states want to reinstate, that we need to continue investing in the upstream sector. Oil and gas is still going to be needed for decades to come. And the prices that you mentioned now, like price volatility, we are seeing prices move over $100, and perhaps this is here to stay. Of course, there's a huge geopolitical premium we're seeing now because of the conflict that's ongoing between Russia and Ukraine. But part of that price is also due to the very, very limited spare capacity. So there's more investment that's needed in spare capacity. That's like in order to avoid a future supply crunch, we need to start investing today because oil and gas production isn't really on, it's not like a tap you turn on and off. You need to invest, wait 5 to 10 years, and then you reap the benefits of production. So seeing the current environment, Gulf states are saying that this is more reason for the West to continue encouraging investment in the upstream sector. Now, on your point on the geopolitical dimension, I wanted to note, I mean, just one thing, there is this illusion of being energy sufficient, or countries not relying on other resources for their energy supply. And I don't think that any country could be energy independent per se. Even if you go to renewable energy, you're going to need materials, metals, etc., that might come from parts of Asia, in China, etc. So you're still going to be reliant on some kind of resource or commodity to sustain your energy supply. So pure energy independence, I don't think is achievable for many countries. So that's something to bear in mind.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your point. Carol, the next question is for you. After the UAE and Saudi Arabia announced their net zero commitments, some critics argued that Gulf states' recent surge in interest in proactive climate diplomacy is cynical, driven by a push for nation branding on the global stage to be viewed as respectable actors and secure the future of oil and gas by influencing climate negotiations. What is your take on this?
Well, look, I mean, you can always be as cynical as you want, depending on the perspective you're taking and where you're coming from when you're looking at other countries, especially if you're depending on them. But let me add, first of all, and what Amina said about this energy independence, it's a political slogan. And if you look at the UK energy security that they announced, strategy that they announced a few weeks ago, they talk about energy, homegrown energy, just to change, the terminology in terms of energy independence. But what is homegrown? I mean, where will the material for solar panels come from? Where will uranium come from for nuclear power, and so on? So that we have to understand that we live in a globalized world. Yes, the war in Ukraine may be a setback for globalization, but we have to understand that at the end, energy security is about diversity and diversity alone, and not really only relying on your domestic production. But what if there is a crisis domestically? What would you do then? You realize that you need to have to trade with others. Now, in terms of what the GCC countries trying to influence climate negotiations, at the end it is negotiation, right? So each party has the right to defend its interests until they reach an agreement where it's the best outcome for all parties involved. But again, we have to really read between the lines. People talk, for example, the expression net zero. What is net zero? Try to compare countries' targets. There's a huge variety in the definition of what net zero means. Look at China. China, you have to be careful when it comes to their climate targets. You have to read between the lines, and actually what they are committing to does not sound as drastic as what their leadership has conveyed. So we have to be careful when we are accusing certain countries of trying to and just doing some PR exercise. For the GCC countries, the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they have all the right to say that, this is our bread and butter, and we know that they are needed globally. And mind you, remember last year, there was a greater push from agencies such as the International Energy Agency when they published their flagship report, Net Zero 2050, and they said we didn't need to invest anymore in oil and gas beyond whatever we had committed to in 2021. Now, and so that was really a big shock for many producers. Now, you might say they had to react that way because they want to protect their assets, but actually they are being realistic. What is happening today? Did you look at the various, if you want, not necessarily U-turn, but modifications and changes to energy targets and policies announced, whether in Europe or elsewhere? People realize that we still need oil and gas investment. And this is, I think, what the countries in the GCC in particular try to convey to the rest of the world. It's not just easy to say, you switch off a button and then you stop investing in oil and gas and we all live happily ever after. The technology is not readily available to ensure that, we can easily turn our back on oil and gas. So I see it, I don't look at it as a cynical way. I don't see it as a PR. I see it as a sensible approach whereby we still need more investment in oil and gas, more diversification of such supplies to ensure greater security of supply, and also to marry between energy security and climate security, because energy transition, remember, does not happen overnight.
Thank you, Carol. Karim, you argue that in one of your recent interviews, you argue that there are two climate action groups in the MENA region: the high ambition, high carbon carbon footprint group of oil and gas exporters, and the low ambition and low carbon footprint group of developing countries in particularly the Levant and Maghreb regions. Can you elaborate on this in the context of Gulf?
Sure. Well, there's an apparent emergence, if you like, of these two groups. There's the group of high emitters, and these are groups, these are countries that have high carbon footprint per capita and high carbon footprint per GDP, per dollar of GDP. They happen to be the oil and gas exporters because of the high carbon footprint of the oil and gas industry itself, albeit not of the goods that get shipped, like the oil and gas itself. But these countries also happen to be the ones with higher ambition. They are the ones that are increasing their ambitions for reducing the carbon emissions on the NDCs, the pledges under the Paris Agreement, but also the ones with the announcements for zero carbon for decarbonization by mid-century. This group of countries seem to be quite distinct. So they're almost all in the GCC. And they seem to be very distinct from the rest of the Arab world and the MENA region. They're also the same group of countries that uses this climate policy. Going back to the question and the conversation you had with Carol just now, they are the same countries that use climate policies as a tool of their public diplomacy. They're certainly a leverage of climate action as one of the tools that a country can use to advance its own interests, and that's fair. And every country does that, and I can see that the GCC does this in a more prominent way. The other group is the low carbon emission group, mostly developing countries, some of them even least developed countries in the Levant, in the North Africa. They are low emission, but also low ambition. They have very low or much lower carbon footprint per capita, but moderate carbon footprint per dollar of GDP. Their climate policies tend to be quite different. They didn't make a strong emphasis on mitigating climate change. Rather, they prioritize adapting to climate change. A lot of them are vulnerable countries, and they feel that this wasn't their responsibility. They didn't cause this climate change. They're more affected by it than they have caused it. Their mitigation plans, as expressed within their pledges under the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, they tend to be conditional on receipt of financial support. For example, they include countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Iraq. A lot of them are major recipients of global climate finance from international institutions dedicated for that. Morocco used to be a climate leader in the region years ago, but there seems to be more within that group now, rather than within the former group of the high ambition and high emission group. So it's an emerging definition. In my view, it's becoming accentuated every year. It will become more apparent by the hosting of COP27 in Egypt, which again emphasizes adaptation and financing and loss and damage, while on the other hand, the following COP28 will be hosted in Abu Dhabi, and it will be all about solutions and decarbonization. And they're very different agendas, nominally in the same region, but very different agendas.
Okay, thank you. Mentioning the financial aspect of energy, I want to ask you a question about prices, Amina. The recent surge in energy prices underscores the risk of phasing out fossil fuel production too quickly without adequate supplies of green energy. Uncertainty remains high, and a balance between environmental concerns and a stable energy market is needed. How will the relationship between energy transition and prices evolve?
Yeah, I think this current surge in prices isn't at a point yet where countries are really rushing towards renewable energy solutions. In fact, we're still seeing European states at the moment, and the US, still trying to secure hydrocarbon resources. So there is no way out of it. For the time being, hydrocarbons are needed, and they're trying to source it from various players, including the Gulf states, other areas in Africa, etc. But Longer term, of course, they're looking for ways to grow their renewable energy sectors, but I see the current situation is going to not have an immediate effect on the progress in that way. But I mean, even in the Gulf here, we're seeing programs. You're mentioning high oil prices. This windfall from higher oil prices isn't necessarily going into renewable energy projects. It's going into building reserves. It's going into different sectors. So I don't really see a speeding up of projects. Things appear to be still on track, but there's no speed up per se.
Okay, thank you so much. Carol, it is a fact that major oil companies like ADNOC and Aramco could contribute dramatically to the energy transition in the region, which would also pioneer the global energy transition considering their scale of impact. These companies have the knowledge, the experience, and the money. Of course, easier said than done. But will we see these energy giants become leaders of green energy as well?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, how you're defining leaders in energy, in green energy, if you're thinking that they would be competing in terms of producing solar panels and wind turbines, there is no reason why they would be better placed than, let's say, other specialized companies in this field. It's not, I mean, producing this kind of source of energy is not the same as producing oil and gas. However, again, if you look at various forecasting agencies about the recommendations, even the IPCC, if you look at the reports about what needs to be done to achieve the climate target, then you can see it's not one technology, it's not one silver bullet, but you need various technologies that are available out there, including technologies such as carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture usage and storage, as well as everybody's today talking about hydrogen. And this is where I see the likes of Saudi Aramco and ADNOC, they do have an advantage over other producing, let's say, other companies or other players out there, because they have been doing this. They have been implementing and using that technology for years. They have the capital, and they've been improving, investing a lot to improve that technology, not only in their country, but they're also supporting the global incentives through other industry association. Hydrogen, the same thing. They've been producing hydrogen for many years, because hydrogen is a normal process when you're to purify certain operations in oil and gas, particularly downstream in petchem, for example. So yes, you need to do it in the right way to clean it up, because you don't want to move through the colors from gray to blue to green. But they do have the ability to do so, and they are well placed to do so. They have the capital, they have the expertise. However, if you ask me whether, as I said, if they want to move to solar panels and wind turbines, that is, maybe not the right way of diversification. But for other things which are needed to pursue the energy transition, I think they are better placed than many other companies out there.
Thank you so much, Karim. When it comes to climate change mitigation, phasing out fossil fuels is the first thing comes to the mind. However, building sustainable cities is key to achieving net zero, considering the fact that 70% of greenhouse gas is generated in cities. For the Gulf, what are the prospects and challenges in achieving sustainable and net zero carbon cities? What has been achieved so far?
Well, transitioning cities to sustainability and net zero is difficult anywhere. Urban systems are interconnected, and there are competing agendas in every city in the world. But the GCC cities have specific challenges that make that transition much more difficult, mostly to do with their geography, where they are, and their climate. And these are very serious challenges. And what these challenges do is they put a ceiling on how much can urban consumption contribute to mitigating carbon emissions. And if you allow me, the challenges list is quite substantial. It starts with planning the cities of the region. They are already planned as low-density, single-use neighborhoods. Walking and cycling is very difficult. Public transportation is not viable at such density. They are largely dependent on public transportation systems, private cars, basically, as they have very limited infrastructure in terms of energy efficient public transportation, like metros, for example. Because of the climate, they need significant indoor cooling and ventilation because of the high temperatures most of the year. And that challenge is coupled with inefficient building stock. Buildings and homes are poorly insulated, offices are glazed, there's prevalence of low efficiency air conditioning systems. And ultimately, the other challenge that cities face is dependence on desalination for potable water. Water doesn't exist for the consumption levels that the cities have. And it simply does not exist anymore for any kind of use. And the only process that currently exists in the region is energy-intensive desalination. It's not even the most efficient desalination system that is available for cities of this region. But there are some prospects for that transition. I painted quite a dark picture there. Some cities in the region, Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi, made some moves. There are some large-scale urban development projects being planned in Saudi Arabia. You've heard all the names. Many of them have integrated carbon mitigation as well as sustainability principles. That transition perhaps started with an increase in awareness that happened over the last 12, 13 years or so. But also, as the market became more mature, there are locally developed appropriate building solutions that made the creation of more sustainable buildings possible. Regulations and incentives have also encouraged sustainable urban development. So now we have new metro networks, for example, in Riyadh and in Doha. We have hundreds of certified green buildings across the Gulf, mostly in the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So there are some steps, some baby steps, but there's a ceiling to how much transition cities of the region can have towards sustainability and net zero.
Interesting. Thank you, Karim. Amina, prominent OPEC members in the Gulf, in the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and UAE, have announced their net zero ambitions for 2060 and 2050, respectively, which was welcomed globally. In the middle and long term, what could be the repercussions of these moves for other OPEC countries? What is the role of OPEC in this equation?
Well, having two significant producers, as you've mentioned, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both announcing targets, net zero targets. Of course, it's leading by example, and it shows that you can still be a major hydrocarbon producer and exporter, but at the same time care about the energy transition and have these long-term goals. So, in that respect, I see them as leading the group to also look at how they could adapt to the energy transition, because this is, as we've mentioned earlier, this is a trend that no one could really ignore. In terms of OPEC, I think OPEC is here to stay for a long time, as long as these producers remain in a cohesive environment and they see a benefit in what they're doing. Managing the market is absolutely necessary in keeping oil relevant for the longest time possible. And this is the reason also that the group decided to expand not just to OPEC Plus, including the non-OPEC members, which gives the group more weight to enable to manage markets. So I don't see a contradiction per se, but one thing that GCC producers really need to work on at the moment, if you look at the aggregate energy that's produced from renewables, it's about 1%. That's the average for the entire region. That's not a lot. And they have very ambitious targets of 50% by 2030 and 2050. So they need to work really hard to achieve those ambitious results. But in terms of influencing OPEC, I think it's a positive step, seeing both Saudi Arabia and the UAE making these changes. And this is going to encourage other producers to do the same.
Thank you for the answer, Carol. From an investor's viewpoint, there's a big question surrounding investing in oil due to the perceived irrationality of investing in a dying resource. Considering the 2030 and 2050 energy transition ambitions around the world, what would what should we expect for oil investments in the Gulf?
Well, look, in the Gulf, then what we are seeing is maybe even, okay, let me put it this way. Before the war in Ukraine, before the rapid escalation in prices, in oil and gas prices, even when the rest of the world was saying we wanted to move away from oil and gas and we're going to reduce our investment in oil and gas, actually producers in the Middle East were moving more into oil and gas for the plain fact because they simply want to capitalize the most on their low-cost assets and they want to be the last to leave the market. Now, today they have a stronger reason because they are receiving the right signal from the rest of the world. So today, this wake up, this what we're seeing today, escalation in prices, the reprioritization of energy security is giving the right incentive and the right indication that more investment in oil and gas is needed, not less, compared to, for example, to what was believed only a year ago. So therefore, I don't see any deceleration in terms of investment in the region. On the contrary, I see an acceleration. And even the big players, for example, the private sector, the international oil companies who wanted to move away gradually from oil and gas, I bet you if Saudi Arabia announces today that they are going to open their doors for these companies to come and invest in their oil sector, I really doubt any of those companies are going to say, no, thank you very much, we're done, because they know this is where the windfall revenues can be made because of the scale of the resources and the reserves available, and also the low cost of production. So but anyway, in investment, you need the right price signal, you need the right government policy around, and also the right cost structure as well. So different factors play into consideration, but I would say the price signal, the market is saying we need more oil and gas investment, not less, and also government policies around the world. We see dramatic changes in the tone, in the objective set, in the determination of these countries that no, actually, energy transition is more about integration, not substitution, until the technology, at least for energy storage, is readily available.
Thank you, Carol. Karim, I have a question similar to the last one. Recently, you have co-authored an article on the circular economy and waste management in MENA cities, which is another critical point in energy transition. What is the situation in the Gulf, and what are the prospects for circular economies?
Sure. I mean, this is not quite a climate issue or an energy issue, but it does have tangential relations. The economies of the MENA region are far from circular. They're very linear economies. They take, they make, they use, dispose. It's fairly straightforward, but they're also not homogeneous in how they do that. The Gulf, as the region that, or the sub-region that we focus on today, is quite differentiated from the rest of the region. The average waste generation per person in the Gulf is twice as much as the Levant or North Africa. The countries of the Gulf are also the countries with the most advanced plans to divert waste from landfills. They've integrated recycling, integrated composting. Sharjah happens to be the leader in the region. It aims to achieve a zero waste to landfill. I think it was meant to happen 2021. I think it's now being pushed a few years back. But countries of the Levant and North Africa, on the other hand, are quite behind. They're still trying to deal with opal dumps and trying to transition that into more sanitary landfills and a little bit of recycling. So the region is not quite the same in what it's trying to achieve. The relationship, perhaps, with climate and energy issues is, in some cases, including Qatar, including UAE, we find waste-to-energy plants, which is considered a sustainable source of energy. They remain to be quite small. I think the facility in Qatar is 15 megawatts in terms of generation capacity, but it provides a solution for generating electricity from a non-fossil fuel source, while at the same time dealing with the waste disposal issue. And Dubai also is installing quite a large waste to energy plant that is due in a couple of years, I believe. So there are certainly some moves, but the overall framework that we discussed within that publication was mostly about circularity and closing the loop and designing products for no waste. And keeping materials in loop, so you don't keep using virgin materials every time you need to create a new product. And that's a very different framing for how the global economy is currently working, and certainly does not happen yet in the GCC.
Okay, thank you. Mina, the European Union hasn't been among the primary, so-called, let's say, primary actors in the region. Eventually, one would argue that EU is yet to become a more influential actor in the Gulf, as its normative and economic power is getting more relevant in the context of green transition. What kind of shifts should we expect for the EU's relevance and presence in the region's energy transition?
Samit, we're kind of seeing it right now. I mean, with the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, we've seen Europe have more conversations with the Gulf region and as well with a number of African states in order to source more gas, to compensate for the losses that they want to basically stop their reliance on Russia. So sourcing more hydrocarbons from the region has been a priority in the time that we're seeing now. But I'm also seeing a trend among large national oil companies here that are developing and investing a lot in technologies to clean up their fuels. And these new fuels have certain specifications that are being required by Europe. So they're preparing for that. They're putting the investment in, and they're realizing that in the future, they will need to export cleaner fuels into Europe. So that's a trend that I'm seeing right now. But just in general, I wanted to mention that the energy transition, and this is something, again, like it's repeated over and over by many Gulf officials, they don't want to see the energy transition conversation dominated by the West, dominated by Europe. They want to have a voice in this conversation. They want to stress the importance of managing this pace. So that's something that Europe needs to consider as well.
Thank you, Amina. Carol, in the best case scenario, we are expecting net zero in 2050, which means that many existing hydrocarbon investments would be useless in the foreseeable future, maybe. What can governments and companies do to minimize the risks of stranded assets in the energy transition?
The concept of stranded asset is not something new. It became more popular because of discussions related to the energy transition, but you know how many discoveries of oil and gas remain stranded because either they are located in places where it is too costly, or the technology to get them out, or the technology is not readily available, or the infrastructure is not there. So having stranded assets is not something new to the industry, and a risk that the industry has learned to live with. Now, of course, it becomes bigger and bigger when people say that they don't want to use oil and gas. What does it mean? This simply translates into lower demand, which in turn translates into lower prices, and therefore those assets that are too expensive to extract, they will of course be stranded. So for me, I think that it's not just, of course, government policy plays a role, but I would say there is a bigger factor, that is the price signal that will determine determine to a large extent whether certain discoveries or certain reserves will remain stranded or not. When it comes to government policy, of course, it plays an important role in terms of amplifying or actually minimizing or reducing the impact of the price signal. And again, it's not something new. So we saw, for example, look, we talk about OPEC and some countries within OPEC struggling to meet their production quota, such as Nigeria, for example. Well, Nigeria, I think one of their main problems, they have a lot of, I think some of the largest deep water and ultra deep water oil and gas resources, but government policy has not been investment friendly, has not been conducive for investment, irrespective of what the oil price is. So this is an example. Leave aside the energy transition, where government policy has already negatively affected the investment climate in the country. Algeria should be playing a much bigger role than what it is playing today with the gas crisis. However, the export potential is constrained, again, because of something that happened over the last year. It's not something that happened yesterday, but you have to look at the long-term trend in the country. And again, policies in place, legislation enacted, and regulations implemented have not been supportive of investment in the country to extract the resources, irrespective of the oil price. I do remember in Algeria in particular, when oil price was over 3 years, $110 on average, Algeria was one of those countries that struggled to attract investment. So in a nutshell, this is not something new we are dealing with. You have to take into consideration the price signal in the future becomes more and more of an issue when demand really peaks and the market starts to shrink. And government policy, it's amazing how many examples are out there and how many experiences governments can learn from. But from my experience dealing with governments, they seem to turn a blind eye on the bigger picture. They don't realize there's actually a global competition for the same capital, and if they're not going to support that capital to come to the country, that capital will go elsewhere where it is more competitive and where there are government policies more attractive.
Thank you, Carol. Here's the last question. We already touched upon this issue at some cases, but Karim, what do you think about the effects of Russia-Ukraine war for the energy transition in the Gulf? Whether I'm asking for the implications, whether direct or indirect.
Sure. Obviously, very hard to speculate what will happen, but I would imagine that plans to transition towards renewable energy in the Gulf could get a little bit of a boost if it releases more oil and gas for export at the current elevated prices. So the increase in energy prices might actually hasten the speed, again, this is speculative on my part, of the transition in order to release more energy for exports. But I think more interestingly, the Ukraine war has also accelerated European plans to reduce their own fossil fuels, and of course expanding renewables and all the low carbon alternatives. This has not been affected, and even with the Repower EU plan proposed by the Commission, the Green Deal, Fit for 55, and all the other climate related legislations are all embedded there. No, there is no change on the medium to long term plans. But that means that Europe would want to transition to renewables, and that would include blue and green hydrogen, which are required for high temperature industries, shipping, and freight, of course. And that trend would accelerate the transition, in my opinion, to energy export by energy exporters to blue and green hydrogen. For example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are very keen on hydrogen, and the increased demand and the increased speed at which Europe now demands that transition to hydrogen rather than natural gas, for example, might accelerate the installation of these facilities and increase their capacity. I think Oman as well, I would add to that list. Having said that, the war itself and the sanctions on Russia might also cause some disruption to some of that energy transition aspect. So the materials and the components, I think, I just referred to and Carol, I think they both refer to the issue of or the fallacy of energy independence, because the disruption to the supply of materials and components needed within the renewable energy system, steel and aluminum and nickel and cobalt, all these other materials that are required for the wind turbines, for the PV cells, will also affect the speed at which they can be deployed. So there are ways, different ways in which this can go in either direction.
Thank you, Karim. That was all. I learned a lot. I hope it was beneficial for our audience as well. Thank you for coming again. I hope we can see you in our next event, like in the future. So, yeah, see you later.